Hello and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe with me, Tom Sherrington, and my great partner, Emma Turner. Hello, Emma.
Hello, Tom. How are you?
Really good. And we're so excited and we're very honoured to have with us the one and only Professor Dylan Wiliam, Emeritus Professor from UCL. Great to have you, Dylan. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
Yeah, so you're talking to us from Florida, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Fantastic. So one of the things we wanted to start off with, just to sort of get the ball rolling, is, to reflect really on the fact that for a lot of people, you're kind of one of the main go-tos for kind of credible thinking about research engagement for teachers. And you kind of have this sort of godfather status for a lot of people because you're so well known, you've been doing it for so long. I just wanted to ask you just how you feel about that. Are you kind of aware of that status you have, and does that kind of weigh heavy on you, or do you feel sort of quite quite relaxed about it?
I don't think it weighs heavy on me. I mean, I think that what I've discovered, the more I look at this, I think I know quite a lot about what is known, but I know that there's a huge amount that I don't know very much about. So, by keeping up to date with the research, I think I'm on top of what we've managed to get really strong evidence on. But the more I do this job, the more amazed I get that teaching ever happens, because it just seems like such a complicated process. Just so many things can go wrong. I'm just amazed that anybody manages to teach anybody anything, because when you can think of all the things that could go wrong, it's just mind-blowing.
That's so interesting. It's like that sort of stuff about the arrow that's always got half the distance still to travel, but it somehow actually manages to get to the target. So it does work. And so Aaron and I were talking earlier about perhaps one of the most recent things you've written. So for people who haven't seen it, the Impact magazine, which is the Chartered College publication, and you've written this really interesting article about how we know whether teachers are effective or not, and the conclusions from that around, what we can do about it. And it sort of has this sort of vibe of being almost depressingly negative at the start, of like, there's nothing we know really about it, and yet that we teachers can improve. So for people who haven't had a chance to read it yet, what's your essential argument that you're projecting in that piece?
I think the reason for writing it is that there's a widespread belief that we know good teaching when we see it. I know good teaching when I see it. I hear that all the time. And I'm just suggesting we need a bit of humility, particularly from school leaders. So school leaders go in and watch a teacher and they say, well, that was good, that wasn't very good. And my point is, we actually know very little about what good teaching looks like. And people say, well, I know good teaching, but how do you know the children learned it? Because our aim as teachers is not to get through the lesson. Our aim is that our children remember what it is that we were talking about in a few weeks' time. So that makes it difficult. What makes it even more difficult is that there is some evidence that some degree of struggle in the learning task will actually make the memory stickier. And therefore, lessons that go really smoothly and the students are led through the content step by step, almost led by the nose, look really impressive. But 3 weeks later, it's as if the men in black have come along with their neuralizers and erased any content of that lesson from the kids' brains. And, every teacher knows this. Every teacher has had this. I taught this to you 2 weeks ago, and the students will swear blind. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. But the lesson wasn't successful because the students didn't remember it. We can get tied up about what the definition of long-term versus short-term memory is. But for me, the important point is a bit of humility here about what makes learning stick and what makes the right learning stick. Students remember lessons with whiz-bangs and all those other kinds of things. We are natural storytelling, story learning animals. But unfortunately, the story doesn't often hold the message we wanted students to remember. Craig Barton has a lovely story about bumping into one of his former pupils in a supermarket. And the kid says, I really love that lesson about Swiss rolls. And Craig asks him, well, what was it about? And all the boy can remember is that it was about Swiss rolls. So I think it's really, really hard. And I think for me, the purpose of writing that article was to get particularly school leaders who think they can improve schools by wandering into classrooms, assessing teachers against a scoring rubric, and then telling them what they're doing wrong. I just think we need to think twice about that. I just think a bit of humility about what constitutes good teaching is really required, because often what teachers do may not seem very sensible to you in the short term, but it could be very sensible in the long term. But it might not be. I'm not saying that it's always good, but I'm saying we need to be much more careful about our knowledge about what makes good teaching. People often produce these kinds of surveys of teaching, these instruments they go into classrooms and observe. And I'm saying, okay, so you've got 20 experts who all agree that this is good teaching. How do you know the children learned it? And a vanishingly small proportion of research actually systematically relates what teachers do in classrooms to whether the children learned it and can recall it 6 weeks, 8 weeks later.
Why do you think that is?
I'm not going to stick on memory. I'd settle for, did you increase their curiosity? Did you increase their enthusiasm? I'm not going to say it has to be a test outcome. Just we as teachers are in the change business. What did you change?
Well, is it hard to do that kind of research? Is that why we don't have enough of it?
It's hard to do it because you need instruments to measure achievement before and afterwards. It's hard to do it because the feedback loops in teaching, as I point out in the article, are really long. So there are some teachers who are really good at improving kids' scores this year, but those kids don't do as well in the future because the teacher is focused on getting the students ready for this year's test, not next year's tests. So every teacher builds on the foundations laid by her predecessors. And some teachers who look very impressive in the short term turn out to be less impressive in the long term. And there's quite a lot of research evidence that shows that that's the case. So then, we can't use value added because most of the value that a teacher adds may not be apparent for 2 or 3 years after that teacher has stopped teaching those children, because what they've done is laid really sound foundations for future learning.
So we're all taking the credit for the people who taught the students before.
Absolutely. There's a paper by Jonah Rockoff that shows that good teachers benefit students for at least 3 years after they stop teaching them. Good teachers make the teachers who teach their students in the future appear to be better than they really are, because they're just capitalizing on the advantages that were produced by that early teacher.
It's interesting because sometimes as a teacher, you can, in the last school that I worked in, I would inherit children from multiple classes into my faculty. And it was really interesting because sometimes I could tell who they'd had before. And it was easier to teach some of the children because they'd had not necessarily a measurable one, but a more effective experience of that curriculum because they were more ready for the bit that I was meant to be teaching. And it was really interesting to think about that longer term journey of effectiveness, that actually it's not what you do now, it's what you do for next. I find that a bit fascinating. But what I wanted to ask you, Dylan, was about that article where we can't measure the learning. Do you think when people say, I know good teaching when I see it, that they're looking at things that aren't necessarily directly about the learning, the content, that they're looking at charisma, or they're looking at good classroom management, or they're looking at other things rather than the actual learning that's going on?
I'm sure they are, and I'm sure they're projecting their own interest in a lesson when they're observing it as well, which we shouldn't forget. But the point is, all these things, classroom management, charisma, they're means to an end, not an end in itself. And for me, it's about, did the children progress? Did they make progress? And it could be in terms of the things measured with a test. It could be with attitudes towards learning. It could be making sure that the students leave our schools at the age of 18 with the passion and curiosity that the 5-year-olds had when they started. I mean, I don't care what measures we use. I never tell teachers what their goals should be. I'm just interested in helping teachers do whatever they've chosen they want to do a bit more effectively.
Mm.
So this is one of the things I'm so interested in. So because when you read through your piece, I mean, it echoes really in a sort of shorter article, essentially the thesis of your book about the American education system. This one here, creating the schools our children need, which is really excellent. And the conclusion really that we need to focus on teacher development. So there's this idea, now if I got this right, that, so for example, I was trying to use this analogy today, that you could say imagine you could measure teachers on a scale of 0 to 100, which you can't, but you don't know whether they're at 30 or 60, but they can all go up to 31 or 61. In other words, wherever they are on your made up scale, you can't tell, but you can push them along. So that's interesting. So why are you so sure that we can improve teachers, even when we're so vague about how to measure their quality?
Well, let me just be clear. We can't measure the quality of any individual teacher with any accuracy. So to put it into context using the 0 to 100 scale that you mentioned, I reckon the error of measurement is 40 points either way.
Right.
So a teacher who's terrible is unlikely to get a great score, and a teacher who is great is unlikely to get a terrible score. But the point is, we know which way is better, but we can't locate any individual teacher on that continuum. How do we know teachers can get better? Because we've shown it. So we know some of the early stuff that Paul Black and I did in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the more recent randomized controlled trial by the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, it recruited 140 high schools. Half of them were given resources for doing formative assessment and professional development, half of them were given cash, and they were basically given minimal support for 2 years, and they just looked at the attainment 8 scores. And in the schools where teachers were supporting each other, developing their practice of classroom formative assessment, the students in Key Stage 4 made approximately 20 to 25% more progress. So we can be reasonably sure that if teachers are focusing on the right things, we can help individual teachers become more effective, provided they're willing to change. The deal breaker is a teacher who says, I don't need to get any better, I get great results as it is. That to me is arrogant, because no teacher I've ever met gets every child that they teach getting 100% on every test. So you can always do better. What those teachers often then say is, well, it's these kids, they don't have the aptitude. But as we've learned from Benjamin Bloom and John Carroll, the best way to think about aptitude is not proportion of taught material retained. It's actually time taken to learn the material, how much support you need. So there's no limit to what any child can achieve if they're willing to work at it. And the fact is that teachers can get better at supporting learners in their learning, especially by being mindful about the sense that their students are making of what the teacher is teaching in the lesson.
Were you going to say something, Tom?
I was going to say, that's a relief, isn't it? I mean, because it's good to know that we could, because I feel like, there's a lot of these things are proxies, aren't they? That some of the controls that leaders put in is because they're trying to hold on to something that they feel is secure, so that knowing that it can be done. So really, it comes down to the things that we're asking people to focus on. Now, one of the things that you mentioned that the work you did with Paul Black. I mean, I'm going to flag it up. I'll bring it up. This is one of my prized possessions. Inside the Black Box. Came into my school in London in 1998, and it was a bit of an exciting time, because we were thinking it's so thin and it's so packed with insights. And one of the things I quote from it all the time is a line which says something about how teachers who are basically trying to get through the lesson can tend to ask a few students a few questions, and they tend to be the ones who were keen to answer, but can be therefore out of touch with the understanding of most of the class. And that to me is such a killer line. And I think, it's so true, isn't it? So that was 25 years ago. Now, why haven't we nailed it then in all that time, do you think?
I think most of us teach in the way that we were taught, unless we take constant efforts to change that. Most of us who are teaching were successful in schools, and so therefore what our teachers did for us worked for us. That's part of it. But it comes basically down to, we've always done it that way. And I just point out to teachers, how can you possibly make a decision that reflects the learning needs of every single pupil in that class if you're only hearing from the confident, articulate students? And there's almost like a kind of, scales falling from the eyes. Oh, yeah. But then, of course, they say, well, I have to get through the lesson.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get through the lesson. I'm not going to finish the syllabus. And I'm saying, yeah, but nobody's with you as it is. So it's just getting the monkey, at the moment, teachers are getting the monkey off their backs and onto their students' backs. I taught it, they just didn't learn it. I think that's immoral. It's logically consistent. Don't do any formative assessment. Never bother finding out what your students are learning. Just dispense the curriculum at a rate that allows you to get through the entire course in the time available, and you feel great. And some students will succeed. Well, I'm saying we need to change that mindset. Getting through the curriculum, if you're not bringing your students with you, is not a good thing. And I think we need leaders also then to support teachers in taking that brave stance to say, I'm not going to teach everything. I'm going to go slower and bring more of the students with me. Some of this stuff is essential. Some of it is desirable. I'm going to cover the essential stuff. I'm going to leave some space, and then I'm going to assess to find out, did they learn it? If they did, I'll do the desirable stuff. If they didn't, I'm going to spend more time on the essential stuff, and the desirable stuff is never going to get done. It's a difficult thing to say, but it's absolutely essential given the overcrowded curriculum that we have in just about every school subject.
I'm smiling so much, Dylan, because that is exactly what I've just said in my book. I'm like, woo, thank goodness I said the right thing. But
my hunch is that the reason for this is that curriculum developers can't bear the thought that any kids might have spare time on their hands. So they make sure they have enough stuff for the fastest learning students to be kept busy all year, which means there's way too much for the average student.
It's really interesting when you actually carve up how much time you have in a school year to teach in each individual subject. I worked it out for primary. For each of the foundation subjects, you have less than 6 full days to teach the whole curriculum for the year. And if you present it like that and then say, well, how are we going to get through this, even get through it, let alone how are we going to secure it, it does make a nonsense of a lot of curriculum design, doesn't it, in terms of what's on the paper versus what you can get off the paper into children's minds with any degree of success, basically.
Of course, it was that lured me into the revision of the national curriculum in 2010. Michael Gove invited me to participate on the promise that the national curriculum would occupy 50% of the available time. And the rest would be the local curriculum. It'd be up to individual schools to decide that. But of course, that's not what happened. Just content got loaded in, and the whole thing we ended up back where we started from, which is an overfull curriculum that is delivered, as Bill Schmidt describes it, as it's a mile wide and an inch deep.
It's interesting that that's the obvious conclusion. So there's a couple of things which we need to, as a system, we need to think about, like making the curriculum have that sort of core plus extras if you can type approach, and then focus on professional development that deals with formative assessment. I'll tell you something I'm really interested in, but you explain this sort of via email, sort of for part of one of our walkthroughs where we were trying to sort of get your ideas straight. And you did a really good job of clarifying for me the difference between some of the terms that get used. So over the years, we've had, assessment for learning, formative assessment, responsive teaching, and I must admit, I was starting to think, where does they all fit and what's part of what? So I don't know if you can, if it's not like putting you on the spot, sort of clarify what you mean by those different terms and how they connect to each other.
Yeah, and I think that's been a hallmark of my work, is I'm really interested in definitions. Because if you don't define the terms you're using, it's very difficult to have productive debates. So Paul Black and I decided on the term formative assessment. The assessment reform group didn't like that. I now realize that the assessment reform group was primarily interested in summative assessment. They wanted portfolios at the end of Key Stage 4, as we learn to call it, that would be more supportive of students' learning and have a positive backwash into the secondary school curriculum. All those people had been involved in records of achievement. So their interest was actually never in formative assessment. It was always summative assessment that had a positive influence on classroom practice. So assessment for motivation, telling students there'll be a test at the end of this week, is assessment for learning. The purpose is to improve learning. It's not formative assessment. Assessment for retrieval practice, giving students practice tests to practice retrieving things, makes the memory stronger. That is assessment for learning. It's not formative assessment. Formative assessment is a small corner of assessment for learning where the evidence is actually used to adapt the classroom work to better meet student learning needs. Some people have focused on adaptive teaching or responsive teaching. The reason I didn't use that term is because, to me, responsive teaching places too much emphasis on the role of the teacher. And that's why, for me, technically, responsive teaching is 2/5 of formative assessment. It is the teacher's job of eliciting evidence and providing feedback appropriately. but we also have to be clear about the learner's role. There are learners being in charge of their own learning and being learning resources for one another. So for me, there are 5 strategies of formative assessment, and the responsive teaching or the adaptive teaching, I think, overplays the role of the teacher. For me, all the formative assessment strategies have a single goal. It is to equip the learner with the skills of managing their own learning more effectively. Good feedback works towards its own redundancy. The idea is that feedback equips the learner with the skills that they need to manage their own learning more effectively. And if we think about our practice as teachers, making our students less dependent on us rather than more dependent on us, I think we'll actually get it right more often than not.
So that's so interesting. So basically, assessment for learning is a massively broad term, which includes all sorts of other things. And formative assessment are the things which you're doing where you have those 5 strategies, and the responsive or adaptive teaching is within that. And that, to me, that makes there's a coherence to that. So now I don't think that's that well understood. You still have people. I was talking to someone last week. They were saying something to me like, "Oh yeah, I do all my AFL and all that." They just banged out the phrase, "I do all my AFL and all that," like it was just a thing. And I was thinking, well, what do you think you mean when you're saying that? And he basically meant asking a few questions. And
because one of the real problems was that when David Miliband was schools minister in the early 2000s, he thought that assessment for learning was tracking pupils' progress with more and more detail. And originally there was national curriculum levels. And because that actually was such a coarse scale that you weren't actually measuring any progress, they invented sub-levels. And that was meant to help. Now, monitoring student progress is not a bad idea. Any well-run organization should be able to monitor its progress towards its goals. But the fact is that kind of approach to what the government called assessment for learning had minimal impact on student achievement, created lots of bureaucracy for teachers, and fundamentally tarnished the term. So people are associating the term assessment for learning with all that nonsense that was going on in the early 2000s, culminating in things like making good progress and record keeping that was fundamentally irrelevant to what teachers were doing day in, day out in the classroom.
It's interesting as well, Tom, and I don't know whether you've seen this, and it reminded me when you said about the person who's done my AFL and all that, is that there are AFL strategies that people accumulate like Pokemon cards and go, right, I'm going to do this one, I'm going to do that one, but then they don't do anything with it. It's like they're doing mini whiteboards or they're doing cold calling, but they're almost using them like little tick boxes to say, well, I'm doing some AFL strategies, but then they don't take any action as a result of it. It's just, oh, I've done it, I can tick it off.
And that's why I started shifting away from data-driven decision-making towards decision-driven data collection.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is we don't collect data for the sake of having data. We collect data in order to inform our decisions. So when teachers collect data, I ask them, well, what decision did you use that data for? What did you do differently as a result of collecting that information? And often, and again, you can see them say, oh, yeah, I missed a chance there, didn't I? Yes, the point is, why did you do it? And so the idea that we should start from the decisions we need to make from, 10 minutes before the end of the lesson. Can I move on to the extension stuff, or should I repeat the main concepts?
Mm-hmm.
On a 2-weekly basis, can I provide extension material, or do I need to spend the last lesson reinforcing the topic? Through to half terms, teach the essential content in 5 weeks, give a test at the end of week 5, and then week 6 is either extension or review, depending what you learned about students' achievement in the test you gave them at the end of week 5. The important thing is it's a shift in teaching from being a linear process to being a contingent one.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that if we want all students to succeed, we have to accept that some students will learn faster than others. We need to find out what they are learning so we can make adjustments in our teaching. Mm-hmm. And that shift is really hard conceptually, from teaching as a linear process, I taught it, I got through the curriculum, to teaching as a contingent process. I don't know what to do next until I find out what sense my students made of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the reasons why I actually quite like the phrase responsive teaching, because it does sort of talk about need. I mean, I have seen a lesson it's one of the examples often used in training of a teacher using mini whiteboards. And she was a newly qualified teacher trying that out. And she was a music teacher, and she'd done quite a nice thing of listening to some music, and they had to identify the music, the instruments, and say something about the piece. It was a Mozart piece, and write it on their board. And they showed her what they thought, and she sort of just panicked and then said, "Okay, board's down," and moved on. And I said, "What happened there? Because you didn't respond to any of it." And she said, "There were so many wrong answers on the boards, I didn't know where to start." Her response was just to do nothing at all, because she was sort of like rabbit in the headlights.
Well, of course, you could have just said, "Okay, I didn't explain that very well. Let's go over it again." But the other thing about mini whiteboards, and I know that Adam Boxer talks very eloquently about them. Here's my problem with mini whiteboards: it gives the teacher a very complicated data processing task. If you've got 30 children writing 5 words on a mini whiteboard, you've given yourselves a really hard task of making sense of that. And that's why I like multiple choice questions. So I would actually have very simple things like, which instruments did you hear in that piece of music? And you have a list of, I don't know, oboe, cello, violin, saxophone, or whatever, and just get the students just to tell you what they heard. And that will give you a very quick read. So it's about the pre-processing of that task by coming up with a good multiple choice question makes the in the lesson task much less cognitively demanding, which allows you to focus on what to do next rather than having to focus on processing the data.
It also keeps your sleeves clean as a child as well, because you've not got as much to write on to rub off when you've got 15 words to rub off.
Always with the practical key stage 1 focus.
Exactly. And that's kind of where I want to take my next question, if that's all right, Tom, because I really want to pick Dylan's brain about research-informed practice for younger pupils. So my kind of area of expertise is early years, primary. And I'm really interested in if there's anything different or that we need to be aware of, or anything to bear in mind when we're using research findings about learning and memory with the very youngest children in the formal school system, because there's lots of information that comes out, and I can see really clearly how it's really easy to apply in upper key stage 2 and in secondary, but some of it, is there another lens that we need to look through with younger children in terms of research?
No. Their brains are the same. It's the same brain. Yeah. And there's a very nice paper by Shana Carpenter and some of her colleagues. Stephen Pam, I think, is one of the co-authors, which actually goes through the research on things like retrieval practice and space practice and interlead practice.
I think I've seen that.
They just show that the same findings crop up whether they are 2 or 22. So I think that the important point is that the way our brains work, the way our memories work, means that retrieving things from memory makes the memory stronger. So, for example, with very young children, let's tell you tying a shoelace. Do it first thing in the morning, do it before lunch, do it again in the afternoon. So that rather than having a session or something which is like an hour long, you actually do 3 20-minute blocks. First thing before lunch, you're breaking up the practice, you're doing interlead practice, and the evidence is, buttoning up your coat, drawing, painting, spelling, same practices. So, just spelling check, write a word on the board. Is this correct? Hold up a red disc if it's wrong, hold up a green disc if it's right. The techniques need to be adapted, but that fundamental commitment to finding out as much as you can about what's going on in the heads of your children right now, I think is crucial. Here's what's really ironic. I worked with the SSAT, the Specialist Schools and Academies Trust, as it was then in England, and they were focusing on secondary schools. My work on formative assessment in Scotland was almost entirely in primary schools. So in Scotland, they think of formative assessment as being mostly for primary schools, with the secondary schools thinking, does this apply to us? And in England, just because of the way we worked, it's seen as exactly the opposite way around, with people saying, oh yeah, but it's fine to do it in secondary, but what about primary?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it doesn't work with Scotland, and that actually does echo exactly what I found as well. But that's really interesting. Thank you.
How does that link to your one of the things that there's a lot of as Dylan Wiliam says, things that you hear. And one of them is something along the lines of cognitive load theory is the most important theory that teachers should know about, or And it's a kind of that kind of theoretical things. I mean, do you still think that, or is that something you see literally like that?
So, I mean, I need to explain why I said that. So first of all, I resisted cognitive load theory for a long time. I came across it in the late 1980s. I did not want it to be true. I wanted to believe that the way I taught maths was the best way for all my learners, the high achievers and the low achievers. So I didn't want cognitive load theory to be true. Eventually, just looking at the research evidence, I was just overwhelmed by it. It is actually very sound and counterintuitive. And more importantly, it explains something that every teacher experiences and has no explanation for. Every teacher has had the experience of teaching a lesson. All the students can do it by the end of the lesson, and yet 2 weeks later, they can't remember any of it. And I think this is one of the fundamental paradoxes of teaching, that students can actually independently complete an instructional task unaided, and yet not remember any of that task or what that task was designed to teach them 2 weeks later. Every teacher has experienced that, but nobody says, why is it happening? Cognitive load theory provides an explanation for that. It is that all their cognitive resources were deployed on solving the problem, say, and therefore there was no cognitive resource left for creating long-term memories. So that's why I think it's really important. I think Robert Bjork's work on memory and retrieval practice and interleaving is really important, but that's not so counterintuitive. I think the idea that students can satisfactorily complete the tasks that we assign them on their own and not learn what those tasks were designed to teach them, I think that's counterintuitive. And that's why I said, I've come to the conclusion that this is the single most important thing for teachers to know. It's not because it's the only important thing, it's the most counterintuitive and the least widely understood in my experience.
That's so interesting. I mean, my example for that is always the school book, the books full of neat tables of information, say, advantages and disadvantages, or, metals and non-metals or whatever, categorized and bookwork done. And then you ask the students to tell you about it, they can't tell any of it. And you keep looking, but you did all of that, and it just doesn't represent their learning at all. It's sort of that task completion. It's a real banana skin in teaching.
Yeah. So, I also was very anti-display bans, and the fact is that there's reasonable evidence that display distracts children. And so I think there's a trade-off here, because I always used to like to display the work of my pupils so they could see their work being valued and honored in that way. But if I was going to do that today, I would have all the display at the back of the classroom. So it was there to be seen, but it wouldn't be visible when you were actually paying attention to what the teacher was doing at the front. So, there's a big problem with that. But I think that, those findings now are pretty clear. And the real problem is this. Cognitive load theory is really important for low working memory students. For high working memory students, it doesn't matter very much. They're relatively rarely cognitively overloaded. But a failure to appreciate the effects of cognitive load theory actually makes the achievement gap greater, because you're teaching in a way that suits the high achievers, the high working memory students, and it doesn't suit the low working memory students. And that's, I think, is the biggest problem. It's about equity. It's about teaching students in a way that they can learn. And I think we haven't appreciated the interaction there between novice expertise. So step-by-step instructions is better for novices, but messy problems are better for experts. So there's this thing called the expertise reversal effect. And we need to be sensitive to those things. What works for experts doesn't work for novices. We need to be, the cognitive load theory doesn't tell you how to teach. There's nothing in cognitive load theory about how you should teach something. It's just a series of constraints that you need to be aware of in terms of how our brains work, in the same way that the architect needs to know about the compressive and tensile strength of steel and stone, but it doesn't tell you what the building should look like. Designing teaching is a fundamentally creative task, but you have to take into account the constraints of our cognitive architecture, as John Sweller calls it.
I like to explain it as you don't put a big display around your telly at home because you want to focus on your telly. You have a bare wall behind your telly.
I had to change the light bulbs either side of my television, because actually they were too bright and I was looking at the light bulb all the time. I had to change it from 40 watts down to 10 watts so it wouldn't actually distract me too much.
So why do you just push back? There are some people who push back against this. They feel it's sort of constraining, that it doesn't deal with sort of emotions and the other ways of learning and experiential learning. So what's your feeling about that? How do we bring those? So although you should know about it, how do we make it seem a little more kind of comprehensive as a theory? Do we think we need to, or?
Well, I mean, the first thing to remember is that cognitive load theory only applies to the learning of things that our brains were not designed to do, what David Geary calls biologically secondary knowledge. So he says that some things we are evolved to learn to do, like recognizing faces. You can't teach children to recognize faces, but exposed to faces, they learn to recognize them. You can't teach children to speak, but if exposed to language, they learn to speak. That's biologically primary. And therefore, guided play, exploration, those are the best ways to learn those things, to get good at those things. Just immersing yourself in a rich environment. But if you want to learn to solve quadratic equations or learn to read and write, then the fact is that cognitive load theory provides a good explanation about the way to do that best of all. Now, it doesn't say anything about how to motivate children, doesn't say anything about the role of emotions. All those things are important. But I think teachers know about that stuff. You know, anybody can tell that a child is upset or is not working because they're distracted or whatever. Cognitive load theory has nothing to say about that. It's a tiny little part of teaching, but it is one which is quite important in terms of low working memory students. And it also, I think, is important in terms of what we're learning about the reciprocal relationship between motivation and achievement. There have been many studies recently that have shown that achievement causes motivation more than motivation causes achievement. But there's nothing so motivating as being successful. And I think we've actually taught a lot of, I mean, it must be terrible to be a kid in a classroom, paying attention to what the teacher is saying, and your mate remembers it all, and you can't remember any of it. And you know, I was trying my best. I was concentrating. I was paying attention. How come it doesn't stick for me and it does for my friend? And I think that is really important to bear in mind. That's why cognitive load theory is important. It provides an explanation of why the same teaching with the same amount of attention and the same amount of motivation might be successful for one learner and not for the other. And we could make it better by reducing the extrinsic cognitive demand, as Sweller calls it, the fact that we made the learning more difficult, unnecessarily so.
I've seen a lot of lessons with extraneous load.
Yeah, well, you know, graphics.
Yeah.
Pictures of brains on a PowerPoint presentation. You know, yes, it's pretty, but what's going to happen? Students are going to be looking at the brain. What are they going to learn by looking at the brain? Nothing. All it's doing is distracting them. It's giving light relief. And so, you know, it just, teachers do that all the time. I mean, you know, I was working with a commercial publisher producing some professional development material, and they put in pictures of brains and question marks and all these kinds of things in the professional development material for teachers. I was saying,
I can change my brain. Well, I want to ask you something. This is something I've been dying to ask you, because I feel this is, so I'm a massive fan. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but one of my, I wrote this blog a while ago about, you know, revisiting Dylan Wiliam's fantastic 5 strategies. And I know it's not just you, it's also, it's Leahy, Lyon, Thompson and William, 2005, the five strategies. And I just think it's such a great framework but in that there are 5, and one of the two of them are very student centered in a way which doesn't always get the profile. One of them is activating learners as instructional resources for one another. Mm-hmm. And the other one is activating learners as the owners of their own learning. That's 2 of the 5. And those things to me are so powerful. And yet, you know, the resources for one another thing. So let's look at that, for example. I mean, where do you see that being done? I mean, where do you see that coming into the lessons in the way that you envisaged?
Well, I see it being done under the heading of collaborative or cooperative learning, and I see it being done really badly. Because what we do is we set up group tasks and we design the task in a way that allows 2 or 3 students to do the work for the whole group. So people say, oh, it's good the kids learn to work together because they'll have to work together in the world of work. That's true, but the boss of the company doesn't care who came up with the solution. They want the best solution. I think the aim of cooperative learning in the classroom is not the best solution. The aim is that every member of that group learns. And therefore, the structures that teachers often use don't promote that. They allow some students to kind of upset themselves. So a classic example would be assigning roles. You're the timekeeper, you're the resource investigator, you're the scribe, you're the reporter. What you've just done by appointing the reporter at the beginning of the task is to give everybody else an excuse to pay no attention. So just a very simple shift, reporter at random. You're not going to know who the reporter is going to be until you finish the work. And now, if Tom is not paying attention, I'm going to be on his case, because we're all going to look bad if you get chosen as the reporter and you haven't been paying attention to what we're doing. So I think, just those very small things like that really make a huge difference. And that's why you can't actually just give teachers techniques. You have to tell them the thinking that goes behind it. Lawrence Stenhouse, memorably in the 1970s, said that most reforms treat teachers in intellectual navvies who are told where to dig, but not why. The fact is that no curriculum scheme can be implemented in the way envisaged by its inventor. You have to work around, you have to make adaptations to fit the school's culture and context. And if teachers don't understand why those things are as they are, they will make the wrong adaptations. Like the teachers who failed to replace the sticks with lollipop sticks. They've been told to use lollipop sticks, but they don't replace the sticks. So now, as soon as you answer the question, you're off the hook for the next 29 questions. So, this was summarized for me by a quote from Millard Fuller, the founder of Habitat for Humanity. He said, in matters of environmental awareness, it's generally easier to get people to act their way into a new way of thinking than it is to get them to think their way into a new way of acting. And that crystallized for me where I've been going wrong with professional development. I have been trying to get teachers to think their way into a new way of acting. My approach now is to get them to act their way into a new way of thinking, but the thinking has to come. You can't just tell teachers what to do. They have to find a way of incorporating that into their own ways of working. And that's why in our professional development model, the number one feature of our process model is choice, giving each teacher the choice about which aspects of formative assessment they want to prioritize in their own professional development. As I often say, the aim of professional development is not to make every teacher into a clone of every other teacher. It is to help each teacher become the best teacher they can be. And that's why I'm okay with different teachers pursuing different routes to becoming excellent.
That's interesting. And the students then being part of the formative assessment process is still important, but you've got to construct it in the right way. And often I find sometimes teachers think, they'll leave that bit out, and they rely too much on their own sort of testing rather than getting the students to work in that way that you've just described. I mean, what's that like in primary, Emma? Do you see that in primary?
What, children supporting each other, children working things out for themselves? Yeah. It's really interesting because all of this kind of, which I'm guessing links to kind of the distributed cognition aspect, you see all of these things done so beautifully in foundation stage with the youngest learners, and it's almost natural for them to work in that way, to learn from each other, to question what they're doing, to interact with the teacher, to be really driven. And then it just sort of dissipates and disappears. And I don't know whether it's the weight of the curriculum that changes, but it's very much alive and kicking in EYFS and in sort of continuous provision models in Key Stage 1, but then gradually kind of disappears in a lot of settings as the children get older. Whether that's just pedagogy, whether it's approaches, whether it's curriculum content, I'm not entirely sure, but there's a definite shift from it's really rich with earlier years and younger children than it is later on at school.
I think it's also partly conditioning. Our students learn that if they don't answer the question, the teacher will answer it for you. So then the students become very resistant.
Yeah.
Years ago, Malcolm Spradbury wrote a great article about conservative pupils. The fact is that students will often resist attempts to do formative assessment. Marking work is not my job, it's your job as the teacher. So often we have students wanting an easy life, and one of the ways is to resist any responsibility for managing their own learning. And they've learned that from us. We've actually trained them to away from that natural learning model that is present in every 5-year-old. And by the time they're
Yeah,
50, they're completely dependent on us.
And it's whether, I don't know whether there is a link to the kind of feedback that children get as well, because you will never find a 5-year-old who tells you that they're really awful at something. They all think they're the greatest writer, the greatest mathematician, the greatest artist. And then they move through the school and the doubt creeps in, or the kind of their perception of where they sit in terms of the rank of mathematicians in that school. And I don't know necessarily what the answer to that is, whether it's the type of feedback that they get or the type of experiences that they have. But it's interesting that you don't get a 5-year-old that thinks they're bad at anything, and then they go through the school system and that changes.
But I think that partly it happens without schools being very much involved. So you see children, young children painting or drawing or whatever, and they're very pleased with it. Round about the age of 6 or 7, they so often tear up their own work. They throw it away. And that happens because they're developing a critical faculty. So I actually think it's the other side of the coin. I think that we want our children to become good self-critical agents. And so I think that does seem to happen, whether the schools are involved or not. I think schools exacerbate it. But I don't think we can blame the schools entirely. It's
I'm not blaming schools. I'm just saying there's a definite shift.
Yeah, it's part of becoming more aware, of becoming critical. And ultimately, that's the only way you get better. The only way you get better at anything is to become critical of your own performance in doing something and work on improving it.
So, Dylan, there's so many things to talk about. We could talk about, feedback. You've changed my thinking or informed so much of it about the nature of feedback and so on. I just want to just briefly, because before we run out of time, is to touch on the book that you're about to publish with Aaron Hamilton and John Hattie, which is called Making Room for Impact, the 9P de-implementation guide for educators, which is fantastic. I've had a privilege of reading it already. And it's full of insights about the things that schools can do to de-implement. And you've got this whole sort of methodology. So why do you think that's such an important thing for schools to be trying to think about in such a systematic way, to do less? Or to
So first of all, I think teachers are working as hard as they can, in my experience. Maybe a few aren't, but most teachers are working as hard as they can. So their plates are full. If they're going to take on anything else, they have to take something off their plate. So the step one is getting leaders to say what they're going to take off the plate. I say to school leaders, what are you going to take off the teacher's plate? And they can't do it. They can't do it because they go through all the list of the things that they currently do. So I can't stop doing that, can't stop doing that, can't stop doing anything. Because they think the way to improve is to stop teachers doing bad things. But very few teachers do bad things. Almost everything teachers do contributes to student learning. So the messy message of this book is the only way, the essence of effective leadership is to stop teachers doing good things to give them time to do even better things. That's what de-implementation is all about. It's recognizing that opportunity cost is the single most important concept in educational improvement, because every hour that our teachers spend on one thing is an hour they don't have to spend on something else. So it comes down to something very simple, actually. Every head I've ever met would want a better set of teachers, more knowledgeable teachers, people with better communication skills, better subject knowledge, whatever. But that's not the question. The question is, given that you have 25 hours of professional development time per teacher, roughly, that's a pretty standard figure in most jurisdictions, what use of that 25 hours each year is going to have the biggest impact on your pupils? That's the only question that leaders should be asking. We can wish for a different world. The world we're in says, you've got this time. What use of that time is going to be most beneficial to the pupils in your school? And that, I think, is where the de-implementation comes in. It's about stopping doing things that are good, but not giving us as much in terms of contributing to pupils' learning as other things we could do with the same amount of time. So, for example, less marking and more time to prepare lessons. Less time writing lengthy comments on school reports, and maybe more time for talking with parents. It's those sorts of things. It's just looking for those little small things that we can actually just change how we spend that 10 minutes, that 15 minutes, that will actually, that make things worse, but it'll allow us to actually put in something even better And I think that's the hard thing to do, because people are professionally invested in what they do. I say to teachers, I think you're spending too much time marking. And they say, are you saying marking is no good? No, marking is good. But just that hour that you spent marking could have been spent in a different way that would have resulted in even more pupil learning. It's not about working harder. It's about finding ways of actually changing what you do to maximize every hour that you have to the benefit of your pupils.
It's got some nice sort of structure there. Like I like this sort of remove, reduce, re-engineer, replace.
Yeah.
So there are different ways of de-implementing and
Yeah.
the whole flow through it. So when's that due to be published?
Corwin tells us is on an accelerated production schedule, so the proofs are with Corwin now. So I just don't know. I'm also not sure. For a long time, a lot of publishers had books printed in Hong Kong because they were cheaper. So you'd have a kind of 6-week wait while the container made its way around the Cape. So I just don't know. But it's mostly Aaron Hamilton's work, I have to be fair, but using some ideas that John and I contributed. But I think it's about recognizing that there's a limited number of hours in the day, and how can we how can we de-implement the things that aren't giving us the best value? And it's hard, which is why the book is so lengthy and goes into extraordinary detail. People said, can't you produce a simple version? No, it's not simple. That's the problem.
I should do a one-pager on it. That'll wind some people up. But so presumably
a poster. Yeah, a poster actually.
A poster, just with icons on it.
Get Ollie on the case.
But presumably, what you'd be saying is, to tie this all up, that 25 hours, we should be talking about formative assessment, shouldn't we?
Well, I think some things, but maybe just giving more time to formative assessment by changing how much time teachers spend writing reports. So, for example, my recommendation is in secondary schools, each subject teacher should give each kid every 2 weeks minus, equals, plus, according to whether they are not meeting expectations, at expectations, or exceeding them, once every 2 weeks. And that goes home to parents, and parents can quickly see, are they falling behind in maths, or is it a general problem? And if you have any questions about this, come and talk to us. The amount of time that teachers spend writing comments that are past their sell-by date by the time they get into the parents' hands is just ludicrous in my view. And so it comes back to this idea of decision-driven data collection. The purpose of reports is to help parents intervene more fruitfully in their child's education. So I think the starting point here is have a focus group. Ask parents, what would you like to know about your child? And when would you like to know it? I joke that school reports are basically ways of spoiling a child's holiday, because they come at the end of the term and, basically it spoils the holiday, but everybody's forgotten what was in it by the time the new term starts. So, I think this idea of decision-driven data collection, designing the system from what people are going to do with the information rather than what information we can give them, I think is transformative.
That sounds sensible, doesn't it, Emma? We talked about reports with Becky Allen. It's one of those hot issues.
I'm just thinking it's so neat because it's linked to everything that we did with James and Richard as well about data and your data strategy. It's absolutely seamless. This link is marvellous. No,
it's brilliant. Well, look, Dylan, it's so great to talk to you. I mean, you're such a mine of information and wisdom and clarity of thinking. And I said at the beginning of this episode of our program that you have this sort of godfather status, but for good reason. And I hope you carry on, wearing the crown, because I think you make a massive difference to a lot of people's thinking, and you kind of lead the way in this whole area. So thank you so much for everything you're doing. It's wonderful and great to talk to you. So thank you very much, Dylan.
It's been fun.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone listening to Mind the Gap. This has been a fantastic episode. Looking forward to future episodes coming up soon. Thank you for listening on our podcast and also on the YouTube channel. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you.